Welcome back to part 3 of my long-term rental setup masterclass. So if you've made it this far, you've already seen the first 2 parts of this series, which involve how to set up your rental, how to price it, how to get photos, how to get phenomenal copy written for your listing, how to screen tenants, which in my opinion is arguably one of the most important parts, and how to get tenants to apply for your rental. So in this masterclass, in this final part, today we're going to talk about how to do a tour in your property, right? So how to allow people to see your property before they move in, how to sign the lease and collect the security deposit, how to hand over the keys, and then finally, how to actually start collecting that rent that you have been promised by the tenant. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So at this point in your rental journey, you've found a great tenant, they love the place, they have submitted their application, and you've decided to approve them. That is awesome. That is like the biggest part. That's the hardest hurdle to get through when you're setting up your first or your next long-term rental. So the next step is we have to get them into the property to actually get a tour to make sure that they really want to go forward with this. Now there's a couple different times when you could set up a tenant tour. The first is before they submit an application. This is going to be more favorable for the tenants. The second way to do it is to set up a tour after they submit an application. So the pros and cons of this, benefits of having the tour after they submit the application are that for the landlord, it's a lot simpler. You already know that this person is seriously interested in your property. So there's not going to be a lot of wasted time. It's not going to be like they're going to show up, maybe take the tour, say, okay, we'll call you later, and then ghost you, right? So there's already some pretty serious interest there. Now, the downside to this is most tenants are going to want to see the property in person before they pay the $30 or $40 to submit their application. This makes total sense. So, I mean, if you put yourself in the tenant's shoes, you probably want to go see your place first before you submit an application as well, right? So I like to have a little empathy there. Now, when it comes to actually performing tours with your future potential residents, there are again a couple different ways you can do this. So one of the ways you can do it is to set up individual tours for each tenant. Now, this is going to be great because it's going to give you some one-on-one time with the potential renter. You're gonna be able to get to know them a little bit better. You're gonna be able to ask them some probing questions. You know, why are you moving? Is there anything that jumps out at you about the property that is a red flag or something that you really like? So this gives you an opportunity to get a lot of really personalized feedback if you're doing one-on-one tours. Now, the other way to do tours with your potential renters is to set up either batch tours, so set up one time where you can do several different people all in one tour, or to just set them up on a one-on-one basis where you're doing a one-on-one tour, but just have 3 or 4 scheduled back-to-back. Now that's the way that I like to do it, right, is the back-to-back method, because it allows me to get that personalized feedback from my tenants, but it also doesn't waste my time, so I'm not driving across town, right, going back and forth. So I like to do the batch method. Now a lot of landlords, they like to do these group tours. I don't like to do that necessarily, although it does save you a lot of time on the landlord side. It feels a little bit impersonal, and in my opinion, it can kind of create this sense of urgency, which may end up deterring some of your future residents. So that really is a personal touch, and it depends on your style and what you value the most. Now here's a pro tip about setting up tours with your tenants. I have lost count of the number of times that I've set up a tenant tour and had a no-show, which is super unfortunate. Having a tenant no-show is not only kind of like not only is it a waste of your time, but it can also be really discouraging, right? So you've done all this work, you've gotten all your, you've put a lot of work into getting your listing up and live, and now they just don't show up. So the way that I do this is I will send out a confirmation message, and I will make it very clear to the person who's touring. I'll send them a message and I'll say, hi, this is Thomas. Just want to confirm that we are set up for XYZ time tomorrow. If I don't hear back from you within an hour of that time, then unfortunately we're going to have to reschedule. This has given me an almost 100% show up rate for my showings, which has saved me a lot of time. And the benefit is that if you show up about an hour beforehand, or if you wait an hour before you have to leave and you still haven't heard back from the tenant, even if they show up, they still didn't follow your instructions, right? So that could be a potential red flag for having them move in and move forward with the lease. So as for the actual conduct of the tours, anytime you're gonna have someone view your property, you want it to be as beautiful as possible. So if you have it staged, obviously make sure all the staging looks fresh. If you don't have it staged, in any case, you want to make sure that all the lights are on, make sure all the blinds or the windows are open, trying to bring in as much natural light as possible. Again, we're trying to make a phenomenal impression on our future residents. We want to show them that we actually care about them and that we want to make the house as comfortable as possible for them. So at this point, we're ready to sign a lease, right? So we have found a tenant, they've toured the place, they like it, they've applied, you're happy with their qualifications, Everyone's ready to go. You've accepted their application. So what's the next step? The next step is to send over a lease, collect the security deposit, and hand over the keys. Now, this is very important because there are a couple things you want to do in order here. Under no circumstances, I want to make this very clear, under no circumstances should you hand over the keys to your tenant before you have A, a signed lease, and B, collected the security deposit. These are two things that are going to protect you in the case of any issues that come up with a tenant, as well as mitigate your risk and help minimize your liability. So the first thing we need to do before the tenant can get the keys is to go ahead and sign a lease. Now, I like to use the standard South Carolina Association of Realtors lease form. This is a pretty generic form. You can find it online, not too difficult. And I always have my tenants e-sign. So everything nowadays is digital. So I don't like to waste my tenants' time to go over and have them sign something in ink. It's just not worth either of our time. Now, you will have some people who prefer to sign in ink. Usually these are people who are a little older, a little less technology friendly. That's totally fine. Either way, whether you have an electronic lease or one that is in physical writing, right? So in wet ink, either one is fine. So a quick note on the lease. Whether or not you use a standard lease form or a personally prepared form, maybe by your attorney, you want to make sure that it is, number one, reviewed by an attorney because this is a legal document. But number two, you want to make sure that you are maintaining a copy of this lease for at least 5 years from the time that it gets signed until the time that you get rid of it. Okay, and this is 5 years after the expiration of the lease, right? So if it's a 2-year lease, you want to keep it for 5 years after that initial 2 years for a total of 7 years. This is number one, to comply with legal requirements, and number two, to make sure that you are covered in the case of a potential lawsuit. So once you have this lease signed, there are a couple more things you have to do with this lease before you can move on to the next step. The first one is to make sure that your tenant has a copy of the lease, right? Think about it from your perspective. If you were a tenant and you were moving in, you would probably want to have a copy of the lease, right? You want to make sure that you know exactly what's required of you, what you need to do in order to maintain a safe and healthy place to live. Additionally, this is a legal requirement for both the tenant and the landlord to have a copy of the lease. So you want to make sure that everyone has a copy to keep yourself covered. The second thing about this lease is that if you make any promises or any concessions to the tenant outside of the lease, right, meaning that it is not written down, then there is zero possibility of enforcing that. Anytime you're signing a legal document, anytime you're making an agreement, particularly with someone who you're entering into a business relationship with, which at the end of the day, right, this is what this is. When you're renting a place, this is a business relationship. You must have everything in writing. If you don't have it in writing, you can't enforce it, and therefore you're not protected. For example, if you were to say, hey, the lease doesn't include a section about pets, but it's okay, you can go ahead and you can have your pet, that's fine, it doesn't bother me. And then the tenant's pet destroys your home, you're not covered, right? There's nothing you can do to say, oh, well, we had an agreement, there's no way to enforce the standard that you're setting via a verbal agreement. On the other hand, if you put in the lease that only one pet is allowed and that any damages will be recouped from the tenant, then that is written in stone and you have the ability to hold each other to that standard. So at this point, we have a tenant, we've sent over the lease, they've signed everything, that's good to go. We have a copy, the tenant has a copy. So our next step is to collect the security deposit. And this is the last step before we can give the tenant their keys. Now the security deposit, there are some legal requirements surrounding the security deposit, so you want to make sure you're paying attention here. There are a couple different ways to collect this deposit. You could do it in cash, which I do not recommend. You can do it through your rental software, so Zillow Rental Manager, for example. I know I mentioned them a lot in this class. They are super helpful and it makes it really easy for the tenant to submit all the rent payments. So they can submit their security deposit through there. Or you could do some other, an ACH to your bank account or Zelle or Venmo, right? Whatever makes you comfortable. But in any case, you must get that security deposit and verify that it is fully cleared their bank account and your bank account before you can get them those keys. Now, when it comes to the security deposit, it's important to note that the deposit must be in a separate account from your operating account. Okay, so this is a South Carolina state law. If you start putting the security deposit into the same account as your operating expense account, this is commingling funds and it is a violation of South Carolina state law. So you need to have a separate place where you're keeping the security deposit. Now, what I would recommend is opening up either a business or personal high yield savings account. You can get 3 to 4% interest, maybe even a little bit more. And if your security deposit is $2,000, you're making 5% interest per year. That's not too bad, right? And that value either will go up and down, right, depending on how much your security deposit is. All right, so now that we've collected the security deposit, we need to collect the first month's rent and hand over the keys. So depending on when the lease starts, if it starts in the middle of the month, you're gonna need to prorate the rent day for day. Now that South Carolina state lease that I use, it has a section in the rental amount that talks about how much the rent is per day. So to make it easy, if your rent is $3,000 a month, divided by 30 days, right? That's $100 a day. Pretty straightforward. If your tenant is moving in 10 days into the month, that means that they'll be living there for 20 days. So we take that $100 a day times 20, that's gonna be $2,000, right? It's pretty straightforward. So at this point, we have the signed lease, we have the security deposit that's kept in a separate account from your operating account. We have collected the appropriate first month's lease. Now it's time to hand over the keys. So this is our final step, right? We're about to hand over the keys. We're about to give the tenant access to their property for the term of the lease, right? So which could be a year, maybe even more. But there are a couple of things we need to look out for. First, when you sign the lease, there are a couple different dates on there. There is the date the lease is signed and the date that the lease starts. Now these are usually gonna be separate dates. In any case, I strongly recommend against giving your tenant the keys and access to the property before the first day of their lease. If you sign a lease that starts August 1st, that means that on the morning of the 1st of August, that's when they get their keys. Now I have a couple different systems that I use to make this easy for both the tenant and myself. The easiest way that I found to do it is just have a little lockbox that's on the front door. You can set a specific code, a 4-digit code, and then you can put the key in that lockbox whenever it's convenient for you and make sure that the tenant has the code, but only give them that code on the day of their move-in, right? So what I do is I set the code. Usually it's, something easy to remember, something associated with the tenant, so it's specific. And then early in the morning, right, I'm an early riser, so maybe it's 6 or 7 a.m., I send over the code saying, hey, welcome to your new home. Here's the code to get access. The keys are in the lockbox. Please let me know if you have any issues. So once they get the keys, now they have access to the property. Awesome. So at this point, your tenant has access to the property. Now there is one more step before you can start collecting your rent on an ongoing basis, that is. And this step is the property walkthrough. Now I didn't mention this before, but this is one of the more important steps, even though they're pretty much all important, right? So when you first have a tenant move in, you need to verify the condition of the property, okay? So what I would recommend is doing a walkthrough with your tenant, right? Going through the house, being very methodical, make sure you're looking at all the windows, all the doors, all the walls, make sure there's no dings, making sure that all the appliances work properly. This is kind of your pre-leasing walkthrough to make sure that both you and the tenant are comfortable with the condition of the property. Now this also has a secondary function. And that secondary function is if your tenant says, hey, this thing is broken, or when they move out, if the property is not in as good as condition as you left it, now you have evidence, right? You have photos, you have videos, you have a signed piece of paper that says, hey, this is the condition of the property upon moving in. And if anything is different from there, other than, small holes in the walls, like from hanging pictures or something like that, then you have the ability to withhold some of the security deposit as recoupment for those damages. All right, well, congratulations. You've made it all the way through my 3-part masterclass, and you now have a on-time rent-paying tenant to start paying your mortgage for you. Now, this was a very long class, and I understand that there was a lot of information here. So if you have any questions or need any help renting out your own property, please feel free to drop a comment or send me a direct message or send me an email. You can find all that information in my channel bio. Thanks for watching.